There's something missing from our skies. The incredible aircraft concept silenced by history. But what if history's silence could be broken? What if history's silence didn't have to be forever? We're diving deep into the archives on a PowerPoint presentation with a difference, as aerospace enthusiast Shizzlesticks delves into the depths of World War II to unravel the secrets of the elusive Vickers victory bomber concept. His mission? To piece together fragments of history, to bring the story of this mythical aircraft to light and give it a place in the spotlight of modern understanding. On his initial quest, he aims to uncover the truth about one of the most enigmatic aircraft concepts born from one of the most intense periods of innovation ever. Welcome to the ultimate journey through aviation history. Welcome to Ethereal Aeronautica. In a galaxy far, far away, somewhere on this oddly familiar orb, is a man. A bloke that accidentally booted a World War II mortar bomb as a child. A man that has a mild obsession with flying tin cans. But this mania didn't start by accidentally kicking death in the balls. Oh no, it started back when he was at college, for he plunged into an aerospace emo phase, where no longer was the mainstream F-15 and F-22 cool. No. To preserve one's rebelliousness, his love went towards the YF-23 and a mug only a mother could love in the form of the X-32. But because of this obsession, this man thought he was the best thing since sliced bread. Until one day he saw something on the tinterweb, something that would redefine what an obscure and awesome aircraft was. Forever. And that man was me. This is a piece of Avro Lancaster bomber which I acquired as a child when parents took me on a walk in the Highlands of Scotland to an Avro Lancaster crash site. And on our way back down from the site towards the path, I stumbled across this very piece of metal. And then I put it in my backpack and proceeded to sort of forget about it. And now I've got to live with the fact that I was a disrespectful piece of shit. But the point is, the Avro Lancaster represented very much what a typical World War II heavy bomber looked like. It had wings in the midsection of the fuselage with 4 engines attached to said wings, each with its own set of prop blades, and a tail at the rear with 2 vertical stabilizers. Now of course there was a few exceptions to the rule. For example, the B-17 Flying Fortress only had 1 vertical stabilizer, but including the exceptions, this was very much the typical configuration for a World War II heavy bomber aircraft. Other aircraft that follow this similar sort of layout include the B-24 Liberator, the B-29 Superfortress, the Handley Page Halifax and the Short Stirling. They all shared a very similar layout. But Barnes Wallis looked at these aircraft and thought, no, we can do better, and then proceeded to throw up the handbook on World War II heavy bomber design. And came up with the Vickers victory bomber. It didn't opt for 4 engines, no, it opted for 6. And on top of that, most depictions of the aircraft show as having contra-rotating propellers, which wasn't really a feature that appeared until after the war had ended, on aircraft such as the Tupolev 95 and the Avro Shackleton, which was a derivative of the Avro Lancaster. And on top of that, to make it look extra alien, it opted for a canard configuration, which was also basically unheard of at the time if you ignore the Wright brothers aircraft. And so that's when the journey sort of begins for me, because a canard layout bomber is basically unheard of. Even now, you don't have these strange bomber concepts. For example, the B-52 Stratofortress, the Tupolev 95, etc. They don't have a canard layout. They have a very typical traditional layout, and while some of those aircraft may sport things like contra-rotating propellers like the aforementioned Tupolev 95, they don't have that weird alien-looking canard configuration. Unless, of course, you're looking at fighter jets like the Saab Gripen, the Eurofighter and the Dassault Rafale, but they're not really heavy bomber aircraft. Sure, they're multi-role, but they're not built specifically to drop bombs. And like I say, that's where this journey begins for me, because I looked at this aircraft in awe when I was a child in college, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to make the world's shittest model of it based on some blueprints I found on Google Images. And that's exactly what I did. And then I posted them online and sort of basically forgot about them. Up until a few months ago, when I went online and found that people were using said images to describe what the aircraft would have looked like. And at that point I realised I'd made a very grave error, because I didn't do my proper research. And so I want to rectify my sins. I want to find out exactly what this aircraft was about, what it was built for, or what it would have been built for, and most importantly, what it actually would have looked like.
The Victory bomber was the brainchild of a man by the name of Barnes Wallis, who brought us explodey things like the bouncing bomb and the Grand Slam bomb. But Mr. Wallis was also quite the tinkerer. He gave us other things like geodetic construction, and he even helped lay down some of the groundwork for variable geometry wing aircraft like the mighty F-111 Aardvark and the very nearly legendary F-14 Tomcat. He's a type of man all good aerospace engineers aspire to be. But back in 1940, before swing wings and the bouncing bomb, Barnes Wallis produced a concept known as the earthquake bomb that would later be the precursor to the Grand Slam bomb. But this wasn't a traditional bomb that would just be lobbed out of an aircraft and then land on the ground and go bang in a big ball of fire, flames, fury and shrapnel. No, this was a bomb that was designed specifically to be dropped at altitudes between 30 and 40,000 feet, and then through the altitude gain free fall speeds of up to 300 miles per hour, using said speed to drive it into the ground upon impact, before then exploding in a rather unsettling way, hence its namesake, the earthquake bomb. It was designed to essentially render anything around it useless through causing a localized earthquake, and through trials and practice, this bomb actually proved to be more deadly than a traditional bomb. So it was given the go-ahead by officials to create something that a bomber could carry, but there was one slight problem. You see, Barnes's concept weighed up to 10 metric tons, which is significantly larger than the small bomb I kicked as a child on the beach. And consequently, no bomber at the time could actually carry such a high payload. So Barnes Wallis then went away, being the engineer that he is, and generated another concept. This was known as the Vickers High Altitude Bomber concept, or the Vickers Victory Bomber Type A, depending on which source you look at. I'll be honest, I'm struggling to deduce which is which at this point because they both look identical. Think Vickers Windsor, but 6 engines. And then officials took one look at this aircraft and said no, because this was an aircraft that had 6 engines instead of 4. Those additional 2 engines could go into another 2 fighter aircraft or go into a medium bomber such as an Avro Manchester, which was basically a shitty version of the Avro Lancaster. It's funny how that aircraft keeps popping up, but anyway. So officials looked at this aircraft and said no, because it was essentially a large resource hog. And outside of that, Wikipedia would have you believe that only a wind tunnel test model was made and that was that. Officials said no and that was the end of it. But that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yes, there were 2 main designs for the Victory bomber. There was the Type A and the Type C and C2. Now, of course, the Type A was the one that came first. It was very classic in terms of its design and sported a very familiar appearance. And of course, with the exception of its larger size and the addition of 2 more engines. Now, I believe the Type A was proposed around about 1941 as the bare minimum for Barnes Wallis. It was theorised to have a maximum altitude of approximately 32,000 feet, and of course it exhibited the 10-ton payload that Barnes Wallis had initially specified. Like I say, it would have done the bare minimum, but it was still a fantastic and smashing aircraft for the period. But after it was rejected, he went back to the drawing board and proposed as Type C2 after further design of the Type C1, and proposed a Type C2 aircraft in 1942. Now, this aircraft was a radical departure in terms of layout from the original Type A, as it exhibited a camelled arrangement, and for a valid reason too, as despite the aircraft only being a smidgen bigger than the Type A, the camels allowed for a reduced wing loading, which increased its ceiling altitude altitude to around 40,000 feet, while simultaneously increasing its payload by around 5 tons, which would essentially future-proof the aircraft for any heavier weapons that may lay waste in the future. Now obviously the newer engines help with this too, but the decision ultimately would have helped propel the aircraft to literally new heights.
So now we've looked at the different designs, and more importantly, the fate of the Type A design, we now need to look at a few misconceptions from current depictions of the Type C-1 and Type C-2.
That's right. There's some elements on some of the depictions of the Victory bomber that are actually probably incorrect, or would have been incorrect had it actually been made. And I'm going to start with the most boring first, and that's the landing gear assembly. Now, I think most depictions of the aircraft are correct in the sense that it would have to have a nose gear, because when you move the wings back, the main gear has to move back with them, and thus the centre of mass is then in front of the main landing gear, so you've got to have a nose gear to counter that. You can't just do what the Lancaster does and have a tail dragger configuration. That just wouldn't work. You just end up with the nose of the aircraft buried into the ground, and the tail gear would be just up in the air doing absolutely nothing. So that makes sense. That makes sense that it has to have a nose gear assembly. I don't think that needs to be explained any further. However, I do think that some depictions of the aircraft that have it with 2 or more wheels per main gear assembly are probably incorrect, at least period incorrect. And I say that because aircraft such as the Avro Lancaster, the Handley Page, Halifax, etc., most RAF heavy bombers at the time actually just had one large wheel per main gear assembly. I don't think they had any more than that off the top of my head. So my depiction of the aircraft is going to just have one large wheel per main gear assembly, and I think that makes sense from a simplicity standpoint. You want to manufacture these things as quickly as possible, so the least components you have, the better, really, in this scenario. So I'll be depicting the aircraft with just one, like I say, one wheel per main gear assembly. It's entirely possible that they would have gravitated towards more wheels later on. I think the Avro Shackleton started out with just having one wheel per main gear assembly, and then it moved to a nose gear assembly, and I think they upgraded the main landing gear to have 2 wheels per gear assembly off the top of my head, but I'll have to have a look at some pictures to back that up. But essentially, that's what the landing gear is going to look like. So now we've got the boring bit out of the way, let's talk about something a bit more exciting, and that's defensive armaments. And I'm going to make this as boring and mundane as possible, because I think most of the pictures of the aircraft are actually incorrect. And I can understand why they're incorrect, because if you look at the Vickers Windsor, which is largely the inspiration, I think, for most of the depictions of this aircraft, it had a really weird gun arrangement. For some reason, on the wings, on the engine pods, you had a couple of guns situated on the wings. And I can't remember if it has any more guns situated, but those are the 2 that stood out to me as being a bit odd. But on most depictions of the Victory bomber, they have machine guns on the top near the front. On the underside, they've got like weird side pods near the end of the fuselage that have guns on them. They have a tail gun, they've got a nose gun. It just basically turned it into a British flying fortress. And I don't think that would have been an accurate depiction of it at all. And I say that because if you look at aircraft that actually opted for altitude and speed, or even just speed, to be honest. If you look at the de Havilland Mosquito, that ditched a lot of its armament in favour of flying faster and being a much smaller aircraft. And on top of that, aircraft that came after the war but were designed during the war for a similar purpose to the Vickers Victory bomber, such as the B-36 Peacemaker, they only opted for a tail gun, as far as I can make. Some of the earlier models might have had more than one turret. But most of the models of the B-36 only just had one tail gun. So I think that's probably what would have happened with the Victory bomber. It would just have had one tail gun, and that would probably be it. There might be an additional turret somewhere else, but probably not. And I say that because the more turrets you add to the aircraft, the more weight it's going to be, which means it's going to have less altitude. It's going to be able to carry less. And just overall, it hinders the performance of the aircraft, and is quite contradictory to what you want the aircraft to achieve, really. And on top of that, like I say, it impacts the speed as well, because all these turrets that you have sticking out of the aircraft are only going to add to parasitic drag, which is not very good for the performance of the aircraft if you're trying to prioritize speed. And speed is particularly useful as well if you want to gain altitude quickly. And so adding turrets onto the aircraft rather unnecessarily as well, because this is an aircraft that was designed to fly higher than fighters could actually fly, to counter it, it just didn't make sense at all. So I think having a single turret at the rear with some machine guns on it is probably sufficient for the aircraft. And now with all of that out of the way, onto whatever clip comes next.
There is, however, one more elephant in the room: contra-rotating propellers. You see, while most depictions of the aircraft show it having contra-rotating propellers, it's worth noting that they weren't really used on World War II RAF aircraft. Moreover, the incorporation of contra-rotating propellers would negatively impact the weight of the aircraft, which obviously then begs the question of whether there's any credence to it utilising such an engine configuration. Introducing Mr. Frederick William Lanchester, who could be considered an underappreciated founding father of aircraft design that, in his time, was essentially laughed out the room for suggesting powered flight was possible after trying to publish a paper in 1987 essentially forming the basis on aerodynamics and aerofoils. His paper was rejected and he was advised to stop pursuing powered flight after nobody took him seriously. However, Frederick did go on to publish another paper which went into some detail on the physics of powered flight, but most importantly in our journey, he patented contra-rotating propellers in 1909, or 1907 depending on your source. Either way, the idea was there, even if it was just a sentence mentioned in passing in a random patent. More importantly though, while the RAF might not have dabbled too much into contra-rotating propellers in World War II, the Navy most definitely did. You see, the Navy had a naval-adapted version of the Spitfire called the Supermarine Seafire, and in 1944 the first Seafire F Mark 46 made its maiden flight, notably the first version to make use of contra-rotating propellers. So it's reasonable to suggest contra-rotating propellers were being looked at and considered prior to that year, which would line it up nicely with Barnes-Wallis's Type C2 proposal date of 1942, and while contra-rotating propellers increase the complexity and weight of the engine, they improve the efficiency of the engine, a feature that would be particularly critical at higher altitudes where the air is notably thinner. Just as notably as well, Supermarine was part of Vickers and had been since 1928. All in all, while I can't be certain the Victory bomber would have utilised contra-rotating propellers, it's also not inconceivable, and given the demanding requirements it may have even been favourable to incorporate them. Here we are, the grand reveal. This is the Vickers Victory bomber, the aircraft that never was. On our short journey, we've rediscovered the origins of this aircraft, why it was proposed, and what it would have carried. From its origins as the humble Type A, all the way through to the awe-inspiring Victory bomber Type C2. Our journey has given us a brief insight into the aircraft that dared to defy the rules of heavy bomber design and illuminated an otherwise murky corner of history. But just as importantly, we've shone a small light on the legacy of Barnes-Wallis, who died in 1979 at the age of 92. The Victory bomber was a radical design, and even after the war had ended, its design was proposed as a platform for using early jet engines, and it was even proposed as an airliner. Sadly, we never got to see this radical, breathtaking aircraft, but hopefully these renders will do it some justice.
perhaps in an alternative world we got to see this aircraft in all its glory. And perhaps it may have even replaced some of the greats we know and love today. But sadly, this is where our journey ends. And as always, goodbye and thanks for watching.